Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our weekly webinar series. Today, our featured topic is emergency restoration. My name is Jessica Petrohoy, and I'm the marketing coordinator at fiberoptic.com. Fiberoptic.com is a leading provider of fiber optic products, training, and rental equipment. We're pleased to present this topic to you today. So with us today to talk about emergency restoration is Chris LaBonge. Chris is the president of the Adtell Group and fiberoptic.com. Today, Chris will be discussing the factors to consider in building your emergency restoration kit, planning restoration, service level agreements, and proper documentation. So remember that our webinar series are recorded and available to you online at fiberoptic.com/webinar. And when Chris is finished, we'll take questions from the GoToWebinar question box at the bottom of your screen. So thank you again for joining us today, and at this time I turn the presentation over to Chris.
Thank you very much, Jessica. I appreciate everybody's time this afternoon to attend our weekly webinar session. So let me begin. So as Jessica mentioned, today we're talking about emergency restoration, and some of the things that we initially wanted to discuss in our webinar, today relate around kind of some similarities between different definitions or confusion around what emergency restoration is. So on this slide here, what we're really talking about is, what is emergency restoration? And how does that differ from maybe plant restoration, which is defined by us differently, and then also a disaster recovery? Because there's different plans that you can have for each of these. And I think when we look at how we define it, we're really going to talk about the scope of work and potentially the methods and procedures that would potentially be used to accomplish each of these goals. So that's the big driver and the difference between each of these. So as we have defined them here, emergency restoration is really just that. It's an emergency situation where we're acting in almost a triage capacity to get the maximum amount of return for our efforts, at any given time. So we're really looking to make the customer service work. We're trying to get them up as quickly as possible, and just focusing on the minimal amount of work required to restore service. So simply getting the customers back up as quick and as efficiently as possible. Plant restoration. When we're talking about plant restoration, that's typically going to be the process where we would go back out, potentially following either disaster recovery, exercise or emergency restoration exercise, where we're going to return to the site. We're going to do that in a maintenance window. We're going to follow a different set of procedures with potentially tighter or more stringent specifications and standards on loss, on craftsmanship, on some of those other things. So the emergency restoration in some scenarios is a temporary fix. And really, when we're getting to a plant restoration, we're really looking at trying to put that permanent fixture back in place, get it to a place where we are completely meeting the standards that our company has set for us in our plant. Disaster recovery. Disaster recovery is probably a little bit more similar to emergency restoration. I think the difference is disaster recovery really is more along the scale. The difference between emergency restoration and disaster recovery has to do with the scale. The disaster recovery is a rebuilding of a significant segment of fiber plant, whether that's potentially a hurricane or an earthquake, where emergency restoration is more specific to a very small segment or a location where we can pinpoint and recover and fix. Disaster recovery requires a set of procedures that are a little bit more to a larger scale, and would have to have prioritization, maybe more construction, maybe tree removal or debris removal services, incorporated. So again, it has to do with the amount of effort that it's going to take to possibly get that up. Yes, we want to still make it as quickly as possible, make the restoration as quickly as possible, but it's not going to be able to be completed in the same type of tasks and time frame. And in some situations, like when we've actually been involved in ourselves, when we were attending a customer's site in Haiti following the earthquake in Haiti, where there was almost complete devastation, we had to help them go in and rebuild, and that required going to multiple sites, multiple cell sites actually, and following the fiber all the way back, looking for breaks, looking for dirt, debris, a whole host of things on a large scale. And then not only do you have to prioritize your tasks, but you also have to prioritize your segments and get your backbone up, first and foremost as well. So restoration planning, the key to be effective is basically to have a plan and to prepare. So planning is, one of the phases that is obviously going to be important. We're going to need to know what we want to do when we arrive on site, what materials we'll need to have, with us, what maps, we'll need, all of the things related to getting organized so that in the heat of the moment, when we need information, we're able to work through a sequence of processes to get us the information that we need to make decisions in the field, because potentially we may not have access to other means of information. Preparation. Some of the preparation is about trying to be able to take some shortcuts. You can plan for a certain type of enclosure. You can plan for a certain type of cable, but the preparation comes from what steps can you take prior to going out that evening or that morning or whatever it may be, and have shortcuts put in place to make the restoration more timely, whether that's potentially using emergency restoration kit, which could potentially include 2 enclosures and 200 meters of fiber between the 2 enclosures, so that you can quickly deploy and reroute around maybe a telephone pole span or 2 that potentially got hit by a vehicle, and you need to splice on both sides of that to get the services back up. That's preparation, so that you're shortcutting your time, not having to build what could be or prep what could be relatively time-consuming actions in the field when it could be done prior to deploying. So what are the steps in that we need to follow when we're working with an emergency restoration process? First thing we need to do is we need to identify what is the cause of our failure. Hopefully, and what we recommend is companies will have emergency restoration procedures, methods or procedures for dealing with emergency restoration. And these should be things that walk technicians through a series of troubleshooting tasks to identify where the problem is. In many situations, you're going to have an outage. You're going to have a no light situation, and that's fine and that's understood. But what is causing that no light situation? Is that a situation that's occurring because of an outage 20 kilometers from where you are? A tree fell on a pole and took out the cable? Or is it a situation where someone unplugged something because there was maintenance work that night? Someone unplugged a fiber and it got contaminated and put it back in, and now the signal loss is to a point where it's not efficient, and the signal is not being reached to the far side. So that's a totally, the location of that is in the head end. So we need to be able to identify quickly where is the cause of my failure. So what we recommend and what we can work with companies to put together is kits, toolkits, or procedures, simply just consulting procedures to say, this is what we recommend. If you have no light, the first thing we want to do is go to the transceiver side and place an OFI on that side of the fiber to see, do we have light transmitting from the transceiver? So that fiber optic identifier, that first acronym there, OFI, fiber optic identifier, that will let us know if we have traffic transmitting. If we have traffic transmitting, there, we want to be very careful about disconnecting our fiber. We want to then check the other side of the link to see, do we have a meter down here that's receiving light on the far side? And if it's not receiving light on the far side, then we now know we've got a problem still, again, focused on the head end side. So then I would start to go and look at my connectors. So we have a video inspection scope that's in our methods and procedures. The next thing that they want to do is look for contamination on the connector. If it's something that's been identified as traffic on both sides, and we figure out where the light is not coming from, we know that the signal is already down for sure, we can then unplug, inspect the end face of the connector to see if there's dirt or debris or damage done to that. If there's no clear identifiable damage, we can put on a visual fault locator and see maybe the connector is snapped or broken right behind the boot. Now, that's a very common point. It's a bend point or flex point for the fiber. So frequently somebody will come along and overbend the fiber on the fiber boot or the connector boot, and it'll be broken in the back end, and a VFL will glow red and allow us to see that there's a problem there. We can also check for light levels coming out of the transceiver right on the launch launch fiber jumper, and we can use our power meters to look at levels there. If everything checks out on that side from the head end, then we start to look at, well, where along the path could we have a problem? We've already put a meter on the far side. We know it's not getting it light down there, so we got to put an OTDR on to try to identify where that loss could be occurring over the course of our span. So those are just some of the methodologies, whether it's in that procedure, there's other procedures that need to be going into this as well. Is certainly open to everybody's own methods of procedure document, but those are some of the things in potential process that I would follow to try to identify where my fault would be occurring and try to narrow in on it. And again, I think it's important to start at one end and move towards the other end of the system, because otherwise, if you look for a connector at the one end and you look for OFI and you see light, but then you run all the way down and you shoot it with an OTDR and you didn't follow those kind of procedures through, well, you may not see a problem there, and then you kind of got to work backwards, and then you kind of start jumping around and guessing, and everything you do starts to have its own kind of dependent kind of reaction, and you start to chase your tail and you're not really able to find where the problem is. So it's important to systematically cross off different tests and move towards a direction where you've kind of investigated all possible causes of your fiber outage from the one end to the other. So now that we've tried to find out where the location of the break is or the failure is, and we've looked at using an OTDR, this is where we would kind of go in and analyze that information. So now we know it's not at the head end. We've done all the testing that we needed to there. We're going to use this OTDR to help find the location of the break in the fiber. One of the ways that we'll talk about a little bit later, how to analyze an OTDR trace, but one of the things that I'm also saying here is OTDRs in emergency restoration situations are not always calibrated. They're not always set for maybe the appropriate index of refraction of the glass of the particular span that we're testing in this situation. Maybe it was brought from another area over and the fiber is a little bit different or something like that. So sometimes the distance measurements can be off by a factor of I don't know, 5 to 10, 5% or more. And on long spans that could be pretty substantial. So if I'm looking at a fiber span and let's say it's 60 kilometers long and I'm looking out 40 kilometers and I see an event, sometimes because of like helix factor of how the fibers kind of coiled in the jacket of the cable, or index of refraction, or some of these other factors, the distances can be a little bit off. So what we want to do is, if we know that there's a regen point potentially 35 kilometers down the line, what I will do is I'll test, and then I will try to measure the distance to that known event from or to the break to that other known location, which would maybe that pass-through or regen point. Because the distance, if we're off by 5%, let's say hypothetically, 5% of 5 kilometers is a lot different than 5% of 40 kilometers. So by getting a location that's known close to the event where the problem is occurring, our margin of error is minimized, and we'll get, if we have to dig something up, we'll get a little bit closer to the cause of the problem, versus, like I said, 40 kilometers, where, if we got to dig something up, we may have to dig up 100 meters worth of alongside the road to try to figure out where a break or something might have occurred, or something along those lines. It's much easier to get close and then try to factor it in from there. Restoration planning. What types of tools do we typically want to include in an emergency restoration kit? So some of the things that I would recommend is a video inspection scope. That would be something, again, that we're using to they say about 70% of fiber outages occur because of connector contamination. So if that's the case, the two things that are going to solve our problem the fastest, or on 70% of our problems, is going to be a video inspection scope and a cleaning kit. So even though doesn't sound like a big emergency, those two things can come into play. Sometimes the connector doesn't even need to be disconnected for that to cause a problem in an emergency event. Sometimes just increase in bandwidth. Let's say it's a 10 gig circuit, but typically it's operating at a much lower rate. As we increase our rate of traffic, it's been only operating at bursts of 1 gig for the majority of the time. But if it ever bursts up to 10 and starts to get some more traffic on it, you could get bit error rates, which could cause confusion within the systems, because it has to retransmit and take the system down. Too much reflection can burn out the transmitter. So those types of things can be caused from contamination. So an inspection scope and a cleaning kit can really solve a good number of those errors that'll typically occur. Visual inspection or visual fault locator. Actually, I'm going to advance, because I know that there's another slide on the inspection scope. So here's a couple of images that kind of highlight where we can run into some problems. So the inspection scope is definitely part of our troubleshooting process. It allows us to look at the end of the connector, and it also allows us to save the connector end face image before and after. So in this example below, we've got some dirt, maybe some oil, chips and pits on the connector, and then some scratches. Well, if we look at the bottom left corner with the dirt and debris, as you'll see, that there's a flake that's probably, or dust particle that's to the, let's say, like 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock of the center of the fiber. That particle is almost the size, it's probably 6-7 microns. It looks like the fiber core is typically around 9. So if we look at that, I'm saying 6 or 7 microns. If someone disconnected that and then immediately plugged it back in, and that shifted around a little bit, that size particle is really able to pretty much block all the transmission power of that fiber at that time in that location. So going in there, being able to identify that, clean that with a video inspection, or identify with a video inspection scope, and then clean it with a cleaning swab, is a way of rectifying that. Same type of thing with the oil. Sometimes oil contamination can kind of move around or be affected, by exterior factors that may be going on in the head-end location. So if something gets bumped around, or someone's moving, let's say, connectors around in the back of a panel because they're doing some splicing on another set of fibers, well, if they move that connector around to make space or shift some things around to create some slack for their own splicing, they may move that connector around just enough to get some oil or other particles or chips to start to affect the transmission there, and that's something else that we have to be able to look for and identify in some of these situations. So 400 power scope will give us this type of clarity. There are 100 power scopes, there are 200 power scopes. I recommend a 400 to be able to zoom into this level to start to see these particles. There was a time where this amount of dirt, at 10 meg, just didn't have any effect. There's such a large amount of spacing between the transmissions that any kind of bit error rates or transmission errors were able to be rebroadcast and resent and the signal cleaned up and not too much damage done. But as the bandwidth has increased, the bit error rate issues are really starting to take down the systems and causing some of these outages. So definitely would recommend a video inspection scope in any kit. The cleaning. The contamination of the end faces is the most common problem. Here we have some tools. Probably the biggest fan of these Pro CS-125 and CS-250 connector cleaners. These are cleaners that you actually would put into a bulkhead. What I like about these is they'll do a connector, or you can use them through a bulkhead to get to the back side of a connector. Whereas in a lot of head-end locations, the back end of the panel may be screwed together or locked in. You're not really supposed to go there. You can clean that back connector from the front through the mating sleeve with one of those pens. They have swabs and other cleaning sticks. Those are fine too. The nice thing about these connector cleaners from Pro is they advance. It looks like a little bit of film, almost a little bit wider than maybe a dental floss type film, and it spins and advances at the same time, kind of creating a wiping motion for the 200, let's say the 125 micron fiber diameter that is coming through the ferrule, at the end of the connector. So. There are also some other tools in there. The Cleatop style cassette cleaners are very popular, and then also alcohol and or some cleaning solvent. Most of our technicians that are out there doing work nowadays are using these solvents. The solvents, one of them is water-based, one of them is not. The water-based solvent is nice for us because we do a lot of fiber testing around the country. High-end fiber characterization testing, and in many of those situations we have to get on planes, we have to travel with this material, and 99% isopropyl alcohol is considered to be a flammable substance and is not able to be taken on planes. So the water-based solvent helps out, and we're able to kind of travel with this, and it makes it quite a bit easier. So that's good. You don't have to worry about material safety data sheets of associated with the and procedures associated with the alcohol, 99% isopropyl alcohol, and things of that nature. So good kit like this that's going to give us all the tools that we need to go in there and clean the ports that we're trying is important. The again, the Pro cleaning connector cleaners, the CS-125 is good for cleaning through the bulkhead and cleaning the far ferrule of the far connector with that wiping motion. Some of these other swabs come in really nicely because they're wide enough to put a lot of pressure on the inside sleeve of a mating sleeve. So we've done enough testing out there that we've identified that the sleeve in many situations is cracked or has its own dust, debris, contamination on it. And while inserting the connector, it's kind of scraping and taking a lot of the contaminants off this inside sleeve. So those other ones I really recommend for cleaning the inside sleeve. So even if there's no connector in there, you would take one of those swabs and kind of piston it in and out of the mating sleeve, and you'll be able to clean those up and repair what could be potentially causing some of your problems with a bad mating sleeve. Visual fault locators, very good tool, very inexpensive tool, but also extremely valuable because you can do a lot of types of testing with it. Very good for testing whether you've got a break in a patch cable. An OTDR is for very long distances. A power meter is great. You can see whether you're getting light through it, but at the same time, you don't know what you're launching out of and what amount you should be able to see. And or on a patch cable where the break is occurring. Maybe in many situations what we found is you take a patch cable, somebody jammed it in the door and closed the door on it and it cracked and they didn't want anybody to know, so they kind of flattened it back out and stuck it back in the rack. And if you're able to put a red light on that, that'll glow red right at the point of the break, and you're very easy to identify where your problem is occurring. These typically transmit in 650 nanometer, and that gives us a pretty good distance. Most of these will be able to transmit light up to, I don't know, about 3 to 5 kilometers. Be pushing. There's some, this VFL 1A, we actually have a very high power one that could do a little bit further distance, but most of the safety class 1 lasers, the safety is to only allow them to go about 3 kilometers, 3 to 5 kilometers. Other things that you can use, you can actually look at whether a fiber is dirty, the connector interface is dirty. If you put a VFL on one side and you don't look into it, but you kind of look sideways at about a 90-degree angle, and you see a little starburst at the top of a connector, even if you didn't have a video inspection scope, you'll be able to tell whether there's contamination on the top of that. If you were to wipe that off and that starburst at the top of the connector kind of goes away, and you can look from a 90-degree angle, you look right across and not see any kind of glowing at the end of it, then you know that you've got a clean connector. I've actually used that as a method before to verify that connector's clean. If it's cracked or anything else, it'll also glow. So you can use it to look for breaks mid jumper, the back of the boot. You can look for contamination on the end of the fiber, a number of those different methodologies. And again, that's probably a tool that for a couple $100, you get the most bang for your buck, so well worth it. OTDRs, obviously an OTDR is an important thing. If you have anything that's occurring greater than, let's say, I don't know, 100 meters, 100 meters maybe inside the building where you still have patch cables that have thin jackets that you can see a VFL glowing through, then you've got an opportunity. But as soon as you transition to an outside jacket, that's the outside OSP cable, you're not going to be able to see through the PVC, and therefore you need an OTDR to help you identify where those breaks are occurring. So what an OTDR is going to give you is it gives you distance to an event, okay, and it also allows you to calculate twist, wraps, and the coil that is associated, with that fiber. So there's a couple of factors that we have to consider. One, as I talked about before, is the index of refraction. So if you're using Corning glass or you're using Draca glass, now Prismium or OFS, you need to make sure you set the index of refraction of the OTDR to the appropriate setting. And the reason is the index of refraction actually determines how fast light travels through that fiber. So light travels through vacuum at a certain speed. It travels through air at a certain speed. It travels through water at a certain speed. And you need to know the speed that the light is traveling through to be able to make some calculations, because what an OTDR is doing is it's sending light from one end, it's hitting an object, reflecting a little bit, and coming back towards the source, which is also has a splitter in there to send some of that returning light back to a receiver, and it clocks that time, and then it divides it in half, and using the index of refraction, if it knows the speed, meaning the index of refraction, if it knows the speed that it's traveling and it cuts it in half, it can do a calculation of the distance to that event. So that's why that's an important thing that we need to understand is, one, the index of refraction, two, any kind of helix factor that we're looking at, which is the corkscrewing effect that we have, where we actually take the cable and we're spinning it around for a segment of length, so that if a cable were to be damaged, we can open up the outside sheath and unwrap it. So what we do is we wrap it clockwise for, let's say, 2-3 meters, then we wrap it counterclockwise for 2-3 meters, then we wrap it clockwise again for 2 or 3 meters. That way every 3 or 4 meters we have the ability to unwrap a section of fiber. If it's always going in the same direction and we need to do a mid-span entry, we don't have any slack there that we can pull our buffer tubes out. So that's an important thing, is we need to know how we're going to work with our buffer tubes and the slack that that needs to be created there. So the OTDR picture depicted below is kind of showing how different events are interpreted on an OTDR trace. So if you look at the top, we're showing you linear kind of representation of a cable, not the loss, but saying, okay, we've got a cable, it's coming out, we've got 3 connectors, then a little bit further out we've got a splice, and then a little further on we've got 2 more connectors. So you'll see that connectors are represented as a spike down on the OTDR trace, which is measuring signal strength over distance. So the distances should line up relatively similar to the cable up at the top, but the way that the event looks will be depicted differently. Anytime you have a change in medium, which is glass hitting air because there's an air gap at a connector, then transitioning back over to glass again, any of those reflections, anytime there's a medium change, you get a reflection, and that's what that spike is that's occurring in the OTDR trace. Conversely, on a splice, what we have is we have a loss, because we have a situation where we've connected and fusion spliced the 2 cables together, 2 fibers together, so we have loss, but there's no medium change. And the glass was spliced directly to glass, there's no air gap between them, so we don't get a reflection. So the splice just shows a drop in power on our OTDR trace and not the corresponding reflections. Some other things to look at, if you look at the connectors that are 3 in a line there on the left-hand side, you'll see that there's a spike on the middle connector that is higher than the 3rd connector in line. Well, that is indicative of a dirty connector. The reflectance, or that spike, a lot of reflections are occurring at that location. That's saying to me, we might have a problem, at that location, or potentially down on the last connector, which also has a relatively high spike. So when I'm going in to look at my problems on an OTDR, I'm looking for a loss on a splice or a connector that drops off maybe a dB or more, 2-3 dB, because typically when we're doing any kind of work, 0.75 dB is what's the allowable loss on a mated pair or a connection. Maybe 0.1 on a fusion splice, if it was done on a V-groove splicer, is acceptable. So if we see losses above 0.75, they're really not supposed to be in the system. So the question is, did multiple, instances occur over time where maybe one connector that was 0.75 was disconnected and reconnected and now is a 2 dB? That didn't take the system out, but then there was another work done some at another location, 20 miles away, where it was unplugged and plugged back in, and that was done at a later time and went from 0.75. They didn't clean it, and now that went to 2 dB. So now the two together are putting over our loss budget. So if we don't see an immediate drop down and a drop of 3 dB or more, where it goes to the noise floor and we start to see all kinds of lines on our OTDR trace, if we're seeing a consistent trace that looks like this and no individual item that's causing the problem, we have to look at the cumulative effect of losses that could be greater than 1 dB adding into our overall loss budget problem. So OTDR is used in this way to identify reflectance, loss, and locations of both reflectance and loss. Very, very important if you have anything breaking mid-span to identify where that is. Obviously, the other hugely important thing when it comes to restoration is our documentation. So do we have a restoration plan? That's the procedures, the methods of procedures we talked about earlier. Do we have final as-built records that we can look at, and our route planning and route mapping documentation? Do we have information about the cable that was installed? to know, do we have problems with different frequencies or wavelengths? Maybe a channel went out because we thought it was a leaf fiber and it's not, and certain channels may not transmit as well as other channels on a certain fiber. Attenuation records, conversion factors. Conversion factors is just a silly thing. It's a cheat sheet, but sometimes we have guys nowadays, a lot of our documentation is in meters in fiber, and some guys still operate in feet, the standard methodology, and the metric, is increasing. But any kind of conversion on OTDRs, if you're handed an OTDR, you're not used to doing it because you're in an emergency situation. Make sure you're able to convert between units, quickly. Bill of materials for the items that you're going to install. Do you have bill of materials if you need to order more, where you would get them, what the procedures are for installing them, directions for installing them. And then also incredibly important is the prioritization of circuits. So if you have an outage, which fibers need to come up first? Do you have any kind of service level agreements on any fibers that need to be addressed? That's incredibly important. We'll go through each of those in a little bit more detail. So the restoration plan, like I mentioned on the previous slide, what is our prioritization? Do we have techs who are on call? Who are our splicing contacts? In a lot of situations, what we have is we have companies that don't have fusion splicers on board, so they have to have a contractor come in. Do you have on-call contractors that are supposed to operate in a 4-hour window from a time of an outage? That's something that's very common. You would want to make sure that you have people on board able to be contacted and contracted immediately at the acknowledgement of an outage. Who is the escalation plan? Who gets called immediately? Is it the splicing team to deploy? Is it the local technician to do some troubleshooting? How do you want to run your escalation procedures and process? Because someone needs to take steps that then need to pass it on to the next layer, and that needs to be followed through to completion and a ticket and a closeout. So what is that escalation plan? So many times we see that problems occur because escalation plans aren't followed and methods and procedures aren't followed. I'm actually a expert witness in a case, no names, but the situation was that an outage occurred and the contractor is being sued for millions and millions of dollars for taking 36 hours to restore an outage. But the contractor who's being sued actually was doing some work on a curb and removing of plants, had nothing to do with the fiber, and they're being sued for the complete outage time of 36 hours. But truthfully, I'm actually helping to defend the one client because the problem, though he is at fault for hitting the cable, a lot of the outage time should have been able to be minimized to 4 hours if procedures were followed, methods of procedures were followed, and escalation plans were put in place to to protect the asset that was in the field. So when the escalation happened and the splicing teams were called in, they weren't on call, they weren't local, they didn't have the right fiber to splice, they didn't have the right cleavers, they didn't know what fiber was in the ground. The fiber was old, so the problem was, it was cracking under their cleavers. They didn't know this. It was a little bit different core size or cladding size because it was, sold like 1986, I think. So it wasn't exactly 125. So the cleavers weren't working. A lot of things happened. And again, the individual who hit the cable was at fault, but there was a lot that could have been done to minimize the time that it took to restore the fiber. And I didn't feel like the individual should have been accountable for lack of preparation and actually really a poor work done by a contractor in fixing the fiber. Location of emergency restoration kits. Do you have kits that can be deployed that are in a market, or do you have to kind of go from scratch? Do technicians have enclosures in their van and extra fiber in their van to deploy something quickly if needed? And then again, back to the prioritization of circuits. Where do we start? Once we get in the field and we know that we're starting our splicing, do we start with the blue buffer tube, the orange buffer tube, the green buffer tube? Where is our traffic? Where are our service level agreements? Where's the customer that could affect us most residing, so that we can get them up? In our documentation, we need to know, what are the final as-built, what are the route, plans and maps. If I'm looking at an outage and I'm looking at some of this information below for the city of Palo Alto, well, if I'm shooting a fiber and it says it's, 4 kilometers in distance to my break, well, I need to know, does that path go down straight 4 kilometers? Probably not. It probably goes down to 5th Street, makes a right, goes a little while, makes a left. It serpentines through an area that is not exactly, a straight line. So if I'm looking for an outage, like a backhoe that maybe hit something, or a car that hit a pole, and the problem is occurring, I need to take a measurement distance, of my fiber plant of 4 kilometers and equate that to a location by knowing my route plan. So that's an important thing that we need to be able to look up. And a lot of times documentation isn't maintained. We really are big proponents of network asset management systems. Obviously, Fiberbase is our software that we use to manage our fiber infrastructure and create maps kind of like this. But taking a GPS location and attaching that to a fiber strand, and then also being able to measure the OTDR trace on top of that fiber, so that we can overlay the OTDR trace, scroll across the OTDR trace to pinpoint the exact location of an event that may be a problem event on our fiber. Those are some pretty important capabilities that a good asset management system will have. And like I said, Fiberbase is one that we work with quite a bit and really like the features of. So that's something that needs to be considered. Manufacturer cable data sheets. Why are we having a problem? What is the characteristics of this fiber? In this scenario, we're talking about single mode and multi-mode fiber in this just chart here, giving some examples. But the idea is, what is the cable capable of performing? If we're getting loss over distance of 1 dB, or is it down around maybe like a 0.2 dB, like we have on this one here at about 1310, it's about 0.2 dB versus 850 at about 1 dB. So the wavelength, potentially what you had as a customer who changed to GBIX in a switch, and because he moved from one wavelength to another, his loss over that fiber is different, and maybe he's not able to reach the far side. That's something that's happened quite a bit to us in the past, where we had somebody go from, let's say on a multi-mode cable, you went from 10 meg or 100 meg system, and then you went to 1 gig. Well, the capabilities and performance capabilities at 1 gig are much shorter than they are at 10 meg. So therefore, when he plugged in his 1 gig system, even though he was operating at 500 meters before, well, his capabilities dropped down to 300 meters at 1 gig, and his system wasn't working, and that was because he changed out his optics. So you got to know how the manufacturer's cable data sheets and also the transceivers, what their threshold and sensitivity settings are. Conversion factors, like I said, I always recommend in any ERK kit that I'm going to put together, I would want to put together a cheat sheet that has the color code, potentially conversion, charts for feet to meters. Obviously, we have, 1 foot equals 0.3. Well, we got an extra decimal point in there, but 0.3 meters. Also, any instructions that may be in the bulk of our let's say outside plant enclosures or rack mount panels or splice trays. If I'm used to doing a 3M enclosure, but in my emergency restoration kit, for some reason I've got Raychem because that's what we've got now. I guess it's I guess it's I forget who makes the Raychem now. Not the old Tyco, but the the idea is if we're using a bunch of equipment that is maybe larger because we're trying to cover a broad set of possible cable breaks, and it's not the one we're used to, we've got to make sure that those instructions and manuals and everything are very clear, laminated, ready to go, so that somebody in a pinch can be able to follow the directions. And maybe, it's when you're looking about measuring cable and splice trays and keeping it neat and trying to be organized, measurements and following those directions on cable management are very important. So take the time. Everybody's got some downtime where they can prep this stuff and be prepared for a bad situation, and all the steps that you take there will certainly make your restoration go much more smoothly. So definitely recommend having a booklet of all the materials and instruction manuals available for the guys. They can just open up the book, flip to that product, and they're ready to go with what they'll need to follow. Bill of materials, like I said, for an outside plant enclosure, a splice tray, the cables that we have, any fan out kits, any cable management. We'd want to know who's the vendor, where are we getting this? If we can't get one, if it happens in the middle of the day, where do I go? Do I go to my local gray bar, or they're going to have this in stock? What do I need to do? Do I have access to cable management solutions like snowshoes, zip ties, and potentially even the complete ERK kit? What is the bill of materials, so that as I'm driving to the site to pick it up, I know what's in my kit, because I've got a breakdown that I can quickly pull in my documentation and say, all right, here's the bill of materials that are going to go that are in my kit when I arrive. Let me grab anything else I might need. And then anything that we talked about before that says these are the important fibers on this span. These are the important circuits on this span. These are the important customers on the span. Who is the customer? Which fiber is he on? And which wavelength is he operating at? That's going to save you money when it comes to service level agreements. Take a prioritized approach to restoring that fiber. So many people don't do this because they get to there and it's an operational thing. It's like, oh, it's easier for me to just do blue because that's the order that I go. But if you've got customers and you're starting to come towards the end of that maintenance window, or that 4-hour time frame that you need to complete emergency restoration, you want to be able to get those first customers up, the most important customers up first. So take the time to highlight a sheet and even organize your traffic that way. Put your most important customers on a certain fiber, or if you want to say, hey, we don't want all of our important customers on one cable or one buffer tube, we're going to separate them out. That's fine too, but then prioritize in some way that people understand, so that you've maybe got the first fiber in each buffer tube is going to be the priority. Okay. Some of the other things to remember, we talked about just going through some stories that have happened. Always be prepared. Have an emergency response go kit. We build these for customers. We're actually starting to sell quite a bit of them. We used to call them ERK kits. Now we're really branding them as go kits, because not everything is an emergency restoration, but certainly the term go implies that it's urgent. So have a kit. Emergency restoration kit would be more or less the enclosure and the cable and everything ready to go, half prepped. The go kit's going to be more or less your equipment, your tools, your test equipment, your splicer, everything you need to get that work done. Have spare fiber. Have your fiber prep tools ready to go. Make sure the employees are properly trained. That's a big factor. When you're trying to do something with speed, under pressure, it's about practice. It's about muscle memory. Don't make the first time that you use a piece of equipment, or don't make it the first time in, 5 months that you've done any kind of splicing, be when you have an outage. Take the time and downtime, use your kit, make sure it's clean, ready to go, and go through the equipment and perform some splicing that keep your kind of muscle memory there and your skills honed. That's incredibly important. We really do a lot of mean time to repair consulting with some customers, and we talk about, one is the technician's capabilities, and two is the equipment, and then three is practicing. Those three things together are really going to drive down your mean time to repair and or your time that's going to take to restore an outage. So here's kind of an example of what we have in emergency restoration kit, or our Go kits. As you can see here, we've got meters, we've got fusion splicers, we've got OTDRs, we've got power meters. There's everything that you would need in one backpack. You can take it, pick it up, throw it in a back of a van. Your tools can all go in the top pouch. Your equipment can go below, or vice versa. But everything you need to do a job is going to be contained in a backpack that is going to be able to get your fiber back up in a timely manner, and again with tools that your technician is comfortable with and has practiced on in the past. Okay, I guess that kind of concludes the presentation. Again, I have some more stories, but I've kind of on 50 minutes already, and it's usually about 50 minutes that we like to spend on these, so got a little bit winded there, I guess, long-winded there on some details. But if you have any questions, feel free to kind of shoot me some of these, and I'll try to answer some. If not, you can email us, obviously, at any time, and we can answer some questions. You've got the training and or the sales emails on the screen now, where you can take some time if you wanted to email either one of those. It'll be able to just mention that if you have a question from the webinar, we'll be able to route it to the right location and get you an answer. So give all the attendees a minute or two to kind of put some questions together. So I'll just hang out for a second. Okay, it doesn't look like anybody's got any real questions, just some general comments. Again, the information is available, fiberup.com/webinar. You can go through and look at this. Most importantly, like I said, we like to talk to everybody on the phone or via email anyway. So since there's not a lot of concrete questions, we'll go ahead and move over to that medium. Feel free to contact us at any time. We're happy to discuss it with you. Thank you so much for your time today, and enjoy the rest of your day.